Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Cress. So I've been doing this series about the Goatman's Bridge, or Old Alton Bridge, near Denton, Texas. And, the last few episodes have been a little heavy. So this time, I wanted to have a little bit of fun. So I've gathered up some Goatman stories for you. So I want to talk about ancient Goatmen, international Goatmen, and other American Goatmen, because there's a lot of them. And a lot of these stories are pretty silly and fun. So anyway, let's get into it. There are tons and tons of stories about Goatmen throughout history. And nowadays it seems like the Goatman is considered almost like a cryptid. He isn't as popular as rumored creatures like Bigfoot, but, he appears in some lists of cryptids, etc. So anyway, where did this idea of Goatmen start? If you want to go really far back, you can think about the Satyrs of Greek mythology, which were male nature spirits that initially were sort of part human, part horse, but then they started getting conflated with the god Pan, who had goat legs and horns. And I'm stopping myself from going on a huge digression here about Pan, but he was sort of a nature god. And if you want to know more about that, you should check out season 2 of the web series Hellier if you haven't already, because in that season, they really explore a lot of the lore surrounding Pan. But anyway, to get back to Goatmen, in addition to satyrs, fauns were a thing in Greek and Roman mythology. So they were half human, half goat creatures that were typically bipedal with human heads, torsos, and arms, but then the horns, tail, and legs of a goat. So, that's starting to sound a bit like the modern cryptid-style Goatman that we hear about. And of course, it's worth noting that depictions of Satan tend to be a bit faun-like. There's the cloven hooves, horns, maybe a goat face, maybe a human face. And, there's kind of this idea that Christianity transformed the old god of Pan into the devil in order to squash older religions and ways of living, etc. So just worth keeping in mind that there's kind of a connection between some depictions of Satan and the modern-day Goatman cryptid. So there are a number of urban legends from around the world tied to different Goatmen. I found stories of a Goatman or Hoofman in New Zealand, for example. He's been seen at different locations in New Zealand, and it sounds like the Maori folks say that they're Kaitiaki. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. I'm sorry. But that would be a sort of guardian entity that protects forests and lakes. So there was this story on hauntedauckland.com about this guardian from the Maniapoto tribe. And this Goatman was sort of like a traveler and lived in this mountain range. And supposedly he was like a twin. So one twin brought good fortune, good things, and the other brought misfortune and death. So I thought this idea of this good and evil twin was really interesting. And so this Goatman entity sometimes comes in the form of a hitchhiker. So per hauntedauckland.com, you stop and give him a lift, but just a short way up the road, he asks to get out, said one believer/witness. Sometimes he just disappears from the car, having safely gotten you past the stretch of road where you were about to have an accident. Just seeing him on a dangerous piece of road has avoided you from an accident about to happen, probably right where he stood. So basically there's this idea that, by picking up the Goatman as a hitchhiker, there can be this protective effect. And I also found an account on Reddit of someone who had an experience of the Goatman as a hitchhiker who disappeared. So if you want to read that, I'll link that in the show notes at buriedsecretspodcast.com. But just in general, the Vanishing Hitchhiker legend is one of the most famous urban legend tropes, at least in the United States. In fact, folklorist Jan Harold Brunvand wrote the book The Vanishing Hitchhiker, American Urban Legends and Their Meanings, which talks extensively about the trope. And he calls it the, quote, classic automobile legend. In the United States version of the legend, the hitchhiker is usually the ghost of a dead person, and sometimes the hitchhiker makes a prophecy before disappearing. So, one question that I had about this vanishing hitchhiker Goatman was, how do people not notice that the person who they just picked up was a Goatman before he got into the car, right? Like, I assume that if you saw a Goatman, your impulse wouldn't be to, pull over and be like, hey, need a lift? There's a story on hauntedauckland.com that does kind of explain this a bit. So to read from that, a strange-looking man in a trench coat which was hitchhiking the Waitui Saddle Road in the early hours in pitch-black darkness. My uncle picked him up. He didn't say a word, just silence. As the truck headed down the road towards Tarongi, the man thumped on the door of the truck to be let off. When the truck came to a stop, the man jumped off the truck and disappeared into the night. My uncle said to me, all you heard was clip-clop, clip-clop. Somehow, his lower half isn't distinguishable until he's in your car. He's very smelly, and if you don't pick him up, something bad will happen. So, in the New Zealand story, apparently some people think that he's maybe an ancestor or a spirit, so, that sort of dovetails with the idea of the ghostly hitchhiker a little. In the comments section of the hauntedauckland.com article, there were some really interesting stories, including one about a goat woman, which I wanted to read. I grew up in Rarotonga, Cook Islands, and lived there until I was 18. There was talk of a goat woman who would sometimes appear at night and on the road in front of you, dressed in a white wedding-like dress and standing upright on two hooves. She had a woman's upper body and goat legs visible beneath her dress. If you saw her, you were to turn back and go in the direction you just came from. Those that carried on through were involved in major accidents and some died, but not before telling about the goat woman. I personally never saw her. So anyway, I thought that was cool. And, I linked to all the articles and stuff that I referenced in the show notes, so you can check those out. And, I was looking for more international goatmen, searching things like Goatman, Europe, etc. And I found an article in the British tabloid The Mirror that I thought was amusing enough to share. In February of this year, 2022, a, quote, 6-foot goat man was supposedly seen near a village called Staverton in Northamptonshire. I'm sure I'm saying all of that wrong. I never know how to say the names of places in England, because I feel like there's always a couple syllables left out. But to me, one of the funniest parts of the story is that the witness went on Mumsnet, which is like a forum for moms. It's pretty well known. So she went on Mumsnet to share her story. And she asked fellow forum goers what they thought she might have seen, and there were just some very fun suggestions. So one person said it could have been a deer with a chronic wasting disease, which supposedly can make them look creepy and humanoid, I guess. A bunch of people said it was probably a kangaroo or a wallaby, which is pretty funny to me because the sighting was in England. However, it sounds like there have been confirmed white wallaby sightings in Warwickshire, so I guess I think they escaped from a zoo or something, so I guess it's not totally out of the range of possibility. Some people suggested that it might have been a heron, which was interesting to me because people have claimed that the Mothman and the Jersey Devil are actually just sandhill cranes, so kind of similar large, skinny bird story or explanation. One person suggested that it could just be someone wearing a strange, fancy dress, which seems random, but I did like it because it had echoes of a woman in white sighting. Then, of course, people started suggesting Slender Man, Goat Man, Sasquatch, the Pope Lick Monster, Skinwalker, etc. I thought the original poster's response to this was hilarious because of what must be a typo. Not a kangaroo, Goat Man, Slender Man, Sasquatch. These things don't exist. I just love the accidental implication that kangaroos don't exist. And I guess I should actually read the original post. So, see what you think. We had been away for a few nights and traveled back quite late. Towards the end of our journey, This was about 2 a.m. We were driving along a road in a rural area when something crossed the road in front of us in full headlights for about 3 seconds. It was about the height of a person, maybe 6 feet or over, but had short, powerful legs and hips, which seemed to move in a circular, fluid fashion. It was not a deer because it stood on 2 legs. This was in the Midlands, and the area is traditional rolling fields and woodland. In this particular spot, there are no houses or buildings. Nearest is over a mile away. We drove back today, as it's only 7 miles from home, to look at the road layout, and whatever it was moved into a wide bowl-shaped field dropping down to a stream. Any ideas? So for any curious listeners from the UK, they were driving on the A425. In the end, though, the original poster said that it definitely wasn't human, whatever they saw, but it kind of seemed like if you combined a goat and a deer. Now, is this a real Goatman sighting? I'm kind of agnostic on this one. I'm not very inclined to believe anything that the mirror says, but I still thought the story was fun. And, I'll include the Mumsnet post if you want to go through the many, many pages of different theories that people had about what this person might have seen. There's a lot of pages, and I only went through the first handful of them. So anyway, I'm sure there are other international goatmen, but none that I was finding in my searches. So let's turn to the United States. There are a number of different goatmen who have been seen in the US, and I have a feeling that my list is not comprehensive. But I found stories in Maryland, Kentucky, Virginia, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and, of course, there's several Texas stories. I think that the most famous goatman is probably the Maryland Goatman. So the legend goes that a scientist working at the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center was experimenting with animal DNA, and one day some goat DNA made contact with his blood, and he turned into a half-man, half-goat creature. I find this hilarious because I'm like, if every time you made contact with an animal's DNA, part of you turned into an animal, then basically almost everyone in the United States would be at least part like chicken person and part cow person, because, eating animals definitely would put you in contact with their DNA. So the silly science, fake science, like superhero logic in here is just a delight to me. Anyway, supposedly the Maryland Goatman roams from Fletchertown Road to Governor's Bridge Road. If you park near the bridge at night and turn off your lights, you might see the Goatman. Sounds familiar. It's very, very similar to the Old Alton Bridge legend about crossing the bridge with your lights off. Some people say that the Goatman carries an axe, and he's supposed to be 7 or 8 feet tall as well. Wikipedia says that the stories began in the 1970s, but it seems like the first sighting of the Maryland Goatman was in 1957, supposedly. I'll include a link in the show notes to an article on the website Phantoms and Monsters that lists a bunch of Maryland Goatman sightings. There have been a bunch of them. He's supposedly been caught on camera once, and in the 1970s, he, supposedly beheaded a dog, and it looks like that got a lot of press attention, and that's what really helped spread these stories. And just in general, I find that so many of the urban legends that I've researched on the podcast were popularized in the 1970s. There's just something in the zeitgeist at the time where, people really wanted to hear silly urban legends and ghost stories and stuff. So another famous American Goatman is the Pope Lick Monster. Also called the Goatman, this monster is supposedly part man, part goat, and part sheep. He lives beneath a railroad bridge over the Pope Lick Creek in Louisville, Kentucky. One version of the story goes that he hypnotizes or uses voice mimicry to lure people onto the bridge to be killed by a passing train. Some people say that he jumps onto the top of trains as they pass by. Others claim that he attacks people with a blood-stained axe, and when people see them, they're so upset that they jump off the bridge to their deaths. Some legends claim that he was a circus freak who wanted to get revenge after being mistreated. Others say that he's the reincarnated form of a local farmer who sacrificed goats for satanic powers. I feel like it's not, a story about a goat in the South without some good old satanic flavor. Or maybe just like it's not a story about anything paranormal ever in the South without some good old satanic flavor. Anyway, there's some of that in the Old Alton Bridge legends as well, but I don't think I've mentioned the satanic parts of the urban legend yet. So don't worry, it's there. I'll get to it. It's coming in a future episode. The book Encyclopedia of Monsters by Daniel Cohen talks about a goatman in Prince George's County, Virginia, who's a sort of lover's lane monster who attacks teenagers who are making out in their car. This has some similarities to the Maryland story. The book says that this goatman has several origin stories. Maybe he's a primeval creature that's always been around there, or maybe he was a government experiment gone wrong. The area is near DC, so the story goes that a researcher was doing experiments on goats at a government facility when things went terribly wrong, and he turned into a half-goat, half-human monster. The researcher fled into the woods, and sort of like Frankenstein's monster, grew up to, quote, hate the human race that now scorns him. And that's why he attacks young couples' cars. Also, some people say that he attacks cars with an axe. A lot of axes in these stories, right? And others say he does it with his bare hands, and he's been blamed for killing dogs and other pets. So, I was reading an old forum thread from the mid-2000s because apparently that's how I do research, and it mentioned a Wisconsin goatman. So here's a story from theshadowlands.net. Legend has it that back in the 60s or 70s, maybe even earlier than that, there used to be a makeout couch located halfway down the road. While late one night after high school prom, a young couple was down there and the goatman killed them and the couch was covered with their remains. Also, a myth with the road is you can travel it one way and it'll be so many miles long, and then you can turn around, go back to the other end, and the length of the road will be dramatically different as legend has it. So another story from this forum. There's this old, creepy, unpaved road called Marsh Road, and we had only heard creepy stories about it. Went there a few times with friends, and it was always creepy, but nothing ever happened. Weird sounds, a seemingly unexplainable thump against our van, but nothing real weird. This sounds like complete BS, and almost certainly is. We had seen the couch on the road, and thought it was odd, but nothing more. Strangely enough, it seemed like the couch sometimes wasn't there, but it would be there next time. That could be chalked up to poor memory, though. The poster also talks about a weird experience on that road where the road was lined with small tires, like hundreds of small tires, just lining the part of the road that had driveways, but they didn't block the driveways. And then the next day they went back and all the tires were gone. And, this poster was like, if it was a prank, it wasn't funny or cool. It was just weird. And it must have taken a long time to line this whole road with tires and then get rid of them the next day. So, explainable, but just weird. In Pennsylvania, there's stories about the Waterford Sheepman. So, seems like the first stories of the Waterford Sheepman arose in the early 1970s. Though, similar to the Old Alton Bridge Goatman, apparently most of the written stuff about the Sheepman is from 2012 or later. It sounds like it was initially just an urban legend that was circulated orally before, stories of it started going around online. Apparently most Sheepman sightings occurred on the Waterford Covered Bridge, or the Old Kissing Bridge, so another bridge. One story recounts someone driving a convertible with a friend, and as they headed toward the bridge, it started to rain. So they went to the covered bridge for shelter and got out to, manually pull up the roof of the convertible. Just then they heard footsteps, and when they turned around, they saw a 6 or 7 foot tall monster with grayish white hair, horns like a goat's or ram's, and fangs. It was walking upright on goat-like legs, and it had hands like a human's, but with claws. The creature attacked them, and they went back to the car and hurried away. Supposedly, the roof of the car was all torn up from the assault. Sounds like there have maybe been around 100 Sheepman sightings between the 1960s and 2012, but as with a lot of the Old Alton Bridge stories, I'm pretty suspicious about the veracity of some of the claims. And maybe worth noting, I think the idea of a goatman guarding a bridge is interesting. It pops up in a lot of these stories, including, of course, the Old Alton Bridge, and, bridges are liminal spaces, and They're also creepy, especially when located in the middle of nowhere, where many of these are or were. But also, I can't help wondering if this has any connection or like anything to do with the old fairy tale about the three goats who have to cross the bridge that's guarded by a troll. I don't know if you remember that from, childhood, but I definitely associate like goats and bridges because of that story. And, in these urban legends, the troll and the goats have been conflated into the Goatman, right? Like, the Goatman is like the troll, but is also a goat. I think this fairy tale is pretty famous, but just in case, if you want to read it, I'll link to it in the show notes, and you can also Google it. The story is officially called The Three Billy Goats Gruff. So, I don't know. It's a bit of a stretch to maybe think that this fairy tale has any kind of connection or influence on these Goatman bridge stories, but it felt worth mentioning. Oh, also related to the Sheepman, there is apparently a cryptid called Sheep Squatch, which is pretty similar to a Sheepman or a Goatman. So I guess that's a thing. I'm not very good at keeping track of niche cryptids, so always learning about new ones. So let's get back to Texas. There are multiple Goatmen in North Texas, where I'm from. And I've actually found stories about 4 separate North Texas Goatmen. The Old Alton Bridge Goatman, the Lake Worth Monster, the Plano Goatman, and the White Rock Lake Goatman. I don't know why, but apparently those of us who are from North Texas really like Goatmen. It's weird. It's really weird, right? And who knows, maybe one of them became a legend. Like, maybe the Old Alton Bridge legend came first, and then people remembered that legend and kind of transposed it to their own towns. I don't know. Or the Lake Worth monster could have been first. I don't know. So let's talk about the Lake Worth monster first. This monster was supposedly a goat man described as half man, half goat, with fur and scales and claws. The main source for this next bit is a Dallas Morning News article, which I'll include a link to in the show notes. But the goat man was apparently seen at Lake Worth in North Texas back in 1969. And the story goes that in the summer of 1969, teenagers went to Greer Island, which is off of the West Fork of the Trinity River in Fort Worth, adjacent to Lake Worth, which was a popular hangout spot. On July 9th, 3 couples were parked there, and a monster jumped onto their cars from the trees above them. The monster tried to grab one of the women, but they sped away before the monster could kidnap her. So, another lover's lane monster. And also there's that element of like kind of a movie monster trying to kidnap a lady, that kind of deal. So at the time, the police dispatcher told the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, "We've had reports about this thing for about 2 months, but we've always laughed them off as pranks." But this report was harder to ignore because there was an 18-inch gash in the side of the car, and the teens were really shaken. So the police investigated. Side note, if someone got in a minor fender bender and didn't want their parents to find out, so then made up the story about a goat man attacking them, if that occurred, I really respect that person. I think that's very creative and very fun. So, I guess that's a possibility. Though I've never heard anyone suggest that the story was made up to cover an accident. It just seems like something a teenager might do, in my opinion. So when the story hit the newspapers the next day, everybody got really into it. And, this is Texas we're talking about. So as the Dallas Morning News puts it, truckloads of men with guns headed toward Greer Island to hunt the thing. And of course, curious people and reporters came as well. According to Rick Pratt, the director of the Greer Island Nature Center at the time, people brought drinks, partied, and tried to hunt the monster. He said, "Here was a Sasquatch of our very own. It was a party. What the hell? Let's go." There's a lot of nice summer vibes to this story, right? On July 10th, the monster appeared again and was spotted by a few dozen people. The monster was up on a cliff that time, and people said he looked angry, and I could imagine why. Then he threw a tire 500 feet. Everyone, including some sheriff's deputies who were there at the time, ran away. According to the Dallas Morning News, one witness said that the monster gave off a pitiful cry like someone was hurting him. The book Encyclopedia of Monsters by Daniel Cohen says that there was a rumor that prior to colonization, there were indigenous legends about a monster near Lake Worth, but they haven't been verified, so I assume that they're made up. Apparently, the Lake Worth monster was a popular story at summer camps in the area, and counselors would tell people that if they listened closely, they could hear the monster's cries on nights like tonight. You know, standard fun campfire story stuff. Since 1969, a lot of people have assumed that the monster was a prank. Here's why. The sightings stopped once the school year started, so people assumed it was just bored kids getting up to trouble during the summer. Though I guess you could complicate that by saying, like, yeah, but there weren't as many bored teenagers hanging out to see a monster during the school year, you know, like everyone wasn't hanging out at the lake. You know, I guess you could argue it either way. In 2005, someone wrote an anonymous letter to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram claiming that they were one of 3 classmates who went out to Lake Worth to scare people using a tinfoil mask. And then in 2009, an unidentified man claimed to have been the person who pretended to be the monster and threw the tire. If true, that is a very brave person to dress up like a monster when a bunch of drunk Texans with guns are running around a lake at night trying to shoot a monster. That very brave prankster, if that's true. There are a lot of differences between the phenomena at the Old Alton Bridge and the Lake Worth monster, since the Lake Worth monster sighting was big news, printed up in a bunch of newspapers, and I will say that the Lake Worth monster sounds pretty hoax-like, whatever. Though who knows? It could have been real phenomena that people just talked about in a cheesy way, I guess. But it's also worth noting that unlike the Old Alton Bridge, there doesn't seem to be a grim backstory behind the Lake Worth monster. It has much more Bigfoot vibes, I guess. Standard cryptid vibes. But this is like a summer party at the lake cryptid. So, I don't know. And in case you're wondering, Lake Worth is about a 1-hour drive away from the Old Alton Bridge, which is very close in Texas terms, right? Like they're in the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex. Oh, interestingly, the Lake Worth monster is supposed to have white hair, and that kind of gives it a sheep squatch vibe, I think. Though there have been reports of white Bigfoots, so that was an interesting detail. To learn more about the white Bigfoot, check out the book Where the Footprints End, High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomenon, Volume 1, Folklore by Joshua Cutchin and Timothy Renner. According to the book, white Bigfoot-type creatures have been reported in Ohio, Kansas, Missouri, New Mexico, California, and Washington. And as the book points out, there are connections between women in white and ghosts and white Bigfoot. And I won't go into all of that here, but check out that book for a really cool analysis. So next, let's talk about the Plano Goatman. I learned about this one from Haunted Plano, Texas by Mary Jacobs, which was published in 2018. So in case you don't know, Plano is a fairly large suburb of Dallas. It's pretty well known around the United States, I think, because there are a lot of corporate headquarters there, like Frito-Lay, JCPenney, Pizza Hut, and Toyota's North American headquarters. It's well known enough that when I tell people in New York City that I'm from the suburbs of Dallas, they often ask me if I'm from Plano. And, one relevant detail about Plano is that part of it does lie in Denton County, which is where the Old Alton Bridge is. So this urban legend apparently originated in Plano in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Here's the story from the Plano Star-Courier. The way I remember it is there was a goat farmer back in the late 1940s who went to school in Plano, said Kenny Smith, a former Plano resident who works at a radio station in Tyler. Evidently, he had a herd of goats and teenagers, went into his land, and decapitated them. It screwed him up bad enough where there are incidents in 1950 in which a couple of teenagers disappeared. It even got to the point where there were kids that were drowning in the creek where Dublin Road crossed at the time. Legend has it that this farmer possibly could have been responsible for these freakish disappearances and these problems with these teenagers around the time. Smith said that the story eventually grew and infiltrated the high school, and high school athletes began using Goatman's Bridge for initiation purposes. So to be clear, this is not the Old Alton Bridge. This is a different Goatman's Bridge in the area. If you had the guts to not believe the legend or myth about those specific happenings, then you could spend the night on the bridge, he said. I never heard of anyone who was stupid enough to do that. If you spend a night on the bridge, the ghost of the Goatman would get you. This bridge, which was allegedly near where Plano East High School was built in 1981, was torn down, but the legend of Goatman lives on in various forms. The article also quotes another person who talks about the Goatman in a local park. We were told if we trespassed on the golf course that this half goat, half man would chase you and throw horse apples at you. He was a child of the former owners of the property when it was a farm. Supposedly, several kids who tried it had died. Don't let the Goatman catch you. So here's another story from Haunted Plano, Texas, by Mary Jacobs. One Planoite remembers driving with friends to the bridge to listen for the Goatman. We had to roll down the windows, unlock the doors, kill the engine, and remove the keys from the ignition, she said. The driver had to give the keys to someone in the back seat. Needless to say, we did not stay long. I swear we could hear hoof sounds on the rocks. Even though it was a long time ago, she added, the memory still spooks her. The book also reports that people have admitted to pretending to be the Goatman to prank their friends, and I've also noticed a bit of pranking in accounts about the Old Alton Bridge as well. So, any of these stories, you should assume that there's a high level of pranking going on and general teenage shenanigans. So then there's the White Rock Lake Goatman, which was new to me. White Rock Lake, which is incredibly difficult for me to say for some reason, is a well-known haunted lake in the area. The lake is in northeast Dallas. It's right next to the Dallas Arboretum, where I go pretty much every time I visit my parents in Texas, so I've spent some time near the lake, but not really on the lake at all. In her 1998 book, Best Tales of Texas Ghosts, Dosia Schultz-Williams talks about the tale of the White Lady of White Rock Lake. She's appeared in the form of a vanishing hitchhiker, a pretty girl in a soaking wet white evening dress. So to read from that, when a sympathetic motorist offers her a ride, she gets in the back seat and gives an address in the area, which was one of Dallas's most prestigious neighborhoods back in the 1920s, out on Gaston Avenue. But soon she disappears, and the startled motorist is left with only a wet seat to attest to her having been in the car. Several people have said that she leaves a wrap in the car that bears a 1920s Neiman Marcus label. It's just, classic vanishing hitchhiker stuff. Supposedly she's the ghost of someone who drowned in the lake in the 1920s. And supposedly the White Lady has shown up at local people's doors. Typically she asks to use the phone and then she disappears. And there have also been reports of seeing her in the water in the lake. But anyway, the Goatman seems to be a more recent legend about the lake. It seems like the story may have been popularized by the author Nick Redfern. He's written a number of popular books on paranormal and conspiracy theory type topics. And he lived near White Rock Lake from 2003 to 2008. Supposedly, this Goatman was seen in the 1970s and 80s, lurking around the trees after sunset. He had the typical Goatman appearance. And I'll have links with more info about that in the show notes if you're curious. So yeah, I don't know why North Texas seems to have so many Goatman stories. I didn't see Goatman stories about other parts of Texas. Like, if you're from Texas and you know of a Goatman story that's not one of the 4 I've talked about, please tell me. I would love to know, but in my searches, I wasn't really seeing it. So I don't know, is it one of those things where there's a urban legend that pops up one place and then it pops up a bunch of other places? Did the White Rock Lake story influence all the others? Seems possible, since there was so much publicity about it. But I don't know, there's just something about that area that loves, a Goatman, particularly one near a body of water. All right, so that's what I've got for this time. Next time I want to talk more about some of the phenomena that people have witnessed at the bridge. Because I think this is the 5th episode in my series about the Goatman's Bridge, but I haven't really talked about the actual paranormal phenomena that people have claimed to have witnessed at the bridge. So I'm excited to get into that. One quick piece of housekeeping. So sorry I didn't post an episode last week. There was a death in my family and I was not really up to recording an episode. But, a month or 2 ago, I said I wanted to try to drop episodes weekly. And I do think dropping them weekly is better for a long series like this, but I've just realized that the workflow that I thought would allow me to drop episodes weekly really isn't working for me. So I'm going to need to go back to the bi-weekly episode drop schedule because I'm just realizing I can't do the amount of research I need to do if I'm dropping things every week. So I'm going to go back to every other week. So sorry to make y'all wait a little longer between episodes. I figure folks would probably like higher quality episodes with better research and information versus just more quantity and frequency. So anyway, thanks for bearing with me as I've been figuring out what the best drop schedule is for me right now. But in the meantime, you can check out buriedsecretspodcast.com, which has the show notes and sources and everything for this episode. If you like this episode, please rate and review it on your podcatcher of choice, but especially Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And please tell your friends about it. That really helps folks find the podcast. And you can also follow me on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast. Thanks so much for listening.